For 5 centuries, humans have proven that when it comes to getting rich quick, we're willing to believe absolutely anything. These historical schemes show that financial stupidity is truly timeless, and that every generation thinks they've discovered the secret to easy wealth. 1. In 1637, the Dutch tulip mania convinced people that flower bulbs were worth more than houses, with single tulips selling for the equivalent of $750,000 today. Investors mortgaged homes and sold family heirlooms to buy tulip futures, believing rare varieties would make them wealthy. People traded tulip contracts in taverns like stock exchanges, buying and selling bulbs that existed only on paper. The bubble burst when people realized they had traded their life savings for flower seeds, and the Dutch economy collapsed when the entire nation discovered that tulips were just pretty flowers that died every winter. 2. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 convinced England that a company with exclusive trading rights to South America would generate infinite profits, despite Spain controlling South America and having no intention of allowing English trade. The company sold shares promising massive returns from gold and exotic goods that would flow from their monopoly on Spanish colonies that were completely off limits. Even the British government invested the national debt, and citizens mortgaged everything to buy shares in a company that couldn't conduct any business. When investors realized the company had never shipped a product or earned a penny, the English economy collapsed. 3. In 1880s Australia, the Poseidon nickel scheme convinced investors that a mining company had discovered unlimited nickel deposits, when it was just digging expensive holes and calling them mines. Promoters claimed revolutionary techniques could extract more nickel than any operation in history, promising dividends so large shareholders could retire within months. Thousands sold homes to buy shares in mines that existed only in brochures. When investigators visited the sites, they found men with shovels digging random holes while executives counted investor money, discovering the unlimited deposits were just dirt. 4. The 1925 Florida land boom convinced Americans that swampland was the most valuable real estate in the country, with promoters selling underwater lots to investors who believed Florida swamps would become luxury resorts. Salesmen used elaborate marketing featuring artist renderings of developments on mosquito-infested wetlands, promising swamp property would appreciate faster than any other investment. Buyers purchased lots sight unseen, often discovering their waterfront property was underwater in alligator swamps with no access. A hurricane revealed most properties were submerged, and investors had paid premium prices for uninhabitable wetland. 5. In 1840s England, railway mania convinced investors that every small town needed railroad connections, leading to schemes for building rail lines to villages with 50 people and underwater tracks across the English Channel. Promoters promised revolutionary transportation would make every investor wealthy through fares and freight from connecting remote villages to cities. Investors funded hundreds of railway companies without investigating economic sense or transportation demand. Most schemes never laid track, with executives spending investor money on offices and personal expenses while claiming construction delays were temporary. 6. The Mississippi Scheme of 1719 convinced French investors that John Law's company could turn Louisiana swampland into a gold-producing paradise that would make France the wealthiest nation in Europe. Law promised his exclusive development rights would generate massive profits from gold mines and agricultural operations in Louisiana. French citizens sold possessions and borrowed to buy shares, believing Louisiana contained unlimited mineral wealth. When explorers reported Louisiana was mostly uninhabitable swampland with no precious metals, the scheme collapsed and bankrupted much of French nobility. 7. In 1870s America, the Credit Mobilier scandal convinced investors that a railroad construction company could generate unlimited profits by charging the government inflated prices while paying themselves massive dividends from public funding. Executives promised government contracts would provide guaranteed returns because taxpayers funded construction, while shareholders received profits. When congressional investigations revealed the company charged twice actual costs and distributed excess payments as dividends, investors discovered they had participated in massive theft of public funds disguised as business opportunity. 8. The 1890s bicycle bubble convinced investors that bicycle manufacturing would dominate transportation forever, with schemes promising everyone would own multiple bicycles and factories would generate profits larger than railroads. Promoters claimed revolutionary bicycle technology would replace horses completely, and investors would receive enormous dividends from unlimited transportation demand. Investors funded hundreds of companies without considering market saturation. When automobiles were invented and consumers lost interest, most bicycle companies collapsed, and investors discovered they had funded an industry quickly replaced by superior technology. 9. In 1920s America, Charles Ponzi convinced investors that trading postal reply coupons could generate 50% returns in 45 days through arbitrage exploiting currency differences between countries. Ponzi promised his international finance understanding allowed buying coupons in one country and redeeming for more valuable stamps elsewhere. Thousands gave him life savings, believing they were participating in legitimate arbitrage. Investigators discovered he was paying early investors with later investors' money while spending funds on personal expenses, and his postal scheme existed only in imagination. 10. The 1849 California gold rush spawned thousands of schemes selling overpriced equipment and transportation to prospectors who believed they would strike rich finding gold in streams. Promoters sold mining tools, fictional guidebooks, and transportation packages promising delivery to goldfields that were claimed or depleted. Entrepreneurs charged enormous prices for basic necessities while claiming California contained unlimited gold waiting to be discovered. Most participants spent more on supplies than they found in gold, and many died pursuing rumors of easy wealth that existed mainly in promotional literature. 11. In 1960s America, the franchise boom convinced investors they could become wealthy purchasing rights to sell hamburgers or cleaning services through revolutionary business models guaranteeing success for anyone following procedures. Companies promised proven systems would allow ordinary people to generate income using established brands and procedures supposedly tested for profitability. Thousands purchased rights without investigating local market support or whether companies had developed profitable systems rather than effective sales presentations. Many discovered their business rights were worthless because companies provided no support and business models didn't work. 12. The 1980s oil and gas limited partnerships convinced investors they could receive massive tax deductions while participating in profitable energy exploration that would generate returns through discoveries in proven regions. Promoters promised partnerships would provide immediate tax benefits and long-term profits through professional exploration using advanced technology. Investors purchased interests believing they were participating in legitimate energy businesses, not realizing partnerships existed primarily to generate sales commissions. When tax changes eliminated deductions and investigations revealed no meaningful exploration, investors discovered they had paid for fictional energy projects. 13. In 1630s Holland, investors convinced themselves that rare tulip varieties represented better investments than real estate, leading to schemes where people traded houses for single flower bulbs with supposedly special properties. Speculators developed elaborate theories about which characteristics would be prized by future buyers, creating classification systems and paying enormous premiums for specific color patterns. Professional traders opened exchanges for tulip futures without seeing actual flowers, creating markets where prices were determined by speculation. When markets collapsed, investors realized they had treated seasonal flowers like permanent investments. 14. The 1990s dot-com bubble convinced investors that internet companies with no revenues or profits would become more valuable than established companies, leading to schemes where investors paid billions for websites that sold pet food at losses. Entrepreneurs promised revolutionary technology would dominate industries by conducting business online, even when models involved losing money on every transaction. Investors funded hundreds of companies without requiring profit proof, believing internet technology exempted them from basic economics. When the bubble burst, investors discovered most companies were spending faster than generating revenue. 15. In 1720s France, the Mississippi Company convinced investors that Louisiana contained unlimited gold and silver that would make France wealthier than Spain's empire when Louisiana was mostly swampland with no precious metals. Promoters used detailed maps showing fictional mines throughout Louisiana, promising colonial development would unlock resources generating enormous wealth. French investors sold properties and borrowed to purchase shares in territory containing no valuable minerals. When explorers reported Louisiana's limited economic potential, stock prices collapsed and bankrupted thousands who believed fictional treasure maps. 16. The 1870s diamond discoveries in South Africa spawned schemes where promoters sold shares in fictional mining companies, claiming exclusive rights to fields that were already owned or didn't exist. Investment schemes promised South African deposits would generate unlimited wealth through revolutionary extraction techniques. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether companies controlled mining territory or possessed equipment for operations. Most schemes collected money for mining that never commenced, with promoters spending funds on personal expenses while claiming delays were temporary setbacks. 17. In 1920s Florida, developers convinced investors that underwater lots would become beachfront property after engineering projects drained swampland and created resort communities where alligators lived. Developers used artist renderings showing how swampland would transform into golf courses and hotels, attracting wealthy tourists. Investors purchased lots believing Florida's climate would make any land profitable once wetlands became usable real estate. When hurricanes revealed most lots were permanently underwater and unsuitable for development, investors discovered they owned uninhabitable swampland worth less than their deeds. 18. The 1840s potato investment schemes convinced Irish investors that new varieties would generate enormous profits through revolutionary agricultural techniques, feeding more people per acre than previous methods. Promoters promised scientific cultivation would allow massive yields, creating wealth through food production and exports to European markets. Irish investors borrowed to purchase expensive seeds and equipment, believing advanced techniques would generate substantial income from small plots. When potato blight destroyed crops, investors realized they had borrowed against harvests that would never occur. 19. In 1960s America, airplane leasing schemes convinced investors they could generate returns by purchasing aircraft and leasing to airlines that supposedly needed more planes than they could buy. Promoters promised airline expansion would create enormous demand for leased aircraft, generating steady income from transportation companies. Investors purchased aircraft without investigating whether airlines needed additional planes or lease payments would cover ownership costs. Most schemes collapsed when airlines preferred owning aircraft rather than paying premium rental fees, and ownership involved enormous maintenance costs, eliminating potential profits. 20. The 1700s South Sea Company convinced English investors that exclusive trading rights with Spanish America would generate unlimited profits, despite Spain having no intention of allowing English trade and the company having no business plan beyond wishful thinking. Promoters promised their government monopoly would import enormous quantities of gold and exotic goods, generating massive profits. English investors used stock as collateral for additional investments, creating speculation bubbles. When Spain confirmed English merchants couldn't trade with colonies, the scheme collapsed and bankrupted much of English nobility. 21. In 1890s America, bicycle manufacturing schemes convinced investors the industry would grow forever because bicycles represented perfect transportation, replacing horses permanently, leading to massive overinvestment in factories that couldn't generate sufficient sales. Promoters promised every family would own multiple bicycles, and manufacturing would generate enormous profits through mass production. Investors funded hundreds of companies without considering market saturation or superior technology possibilities. When automobiles were invented and consumers abandoned bicycles, most investments became worthless overnight. 22. The 1920s radio stock bubble convinced investors that radio companies would dominate entertainment forever, with schemes promising radio would generate unlimited profits through advertising and equipment sales to consumers purchasing multiple sets. Promoters claimed broadcasting technology would create enormous wealth for companies controlling stations, manufacturing equipment, or owning programming content. Investors purchased shares at prices assuming unlimited growth, without considering market support or competition from future innovations. When markets crashed and television began development, many radio investments lost value. 23. In 1850s America, transcontinental railroad schemes convinced investors that companies would generate unlimited profits, connecting coasts through revolutionary transportation, dominating American commerce forever, leading to overinvestment in railways that couldn't generate sufficient revenue. Promoters promised transcontinental railways would carry enormous traffic, generating massive profits through monopolistic transportation control. Investors funded dozens of competing companies without investigating whether America needed multiple railways or construction costs could be recovered. Many schemes collected money for projects never completed, with executives spending on personal expenses. 24. The 1970s silver investment schemes convinced investors that industrial demand would make prices rise forever, leading to speculation where investors borrowed to purchase silver bars supposedly representing better investments than stocks or real estate. Promoters claimed industrial uses in photography and electronics would create unlimited demand, driving prices continually higher. Investors purchased silver without understanding that industrial demand was limited, and prices were subject to manipulation. When prices collapsed after artificial highs, investors discovered they had borrowed to purchase a commodity whose price was determined by speculation. 25. In 1840s England, railway schemes convinced investors that every village needed railroad connections, leading to proposals for lines to communities with fewer than 100 people and projects defying geography by running through mountains and under the English Channel. Promoters promised revolutionary transportation would make every investment profitable through passenger fares from connecting remote communities. Investors funded companies without investigating economic sense or community transportation demand. Most schemes never laid track, with executives spending on promotional campaigns while claiming construction delays were temporary setbacks. 26. The 1990s multi-level marketing explosion convinced investors they could become wealthy, selling overpriced vitamins and cosmetics to friends, while recruiting others to join sales organizations sharing unlimited profits from revolutionary distribution systems. MLM companies promised innovative marketing would allow ordinary people to generate income-building networks of salespeople, selling products and recruiting additional participants. Investors purchased starter kits without investigating whether products were competitively priced or compensation systems could generate profits for anyone other than founders. Most participants lost money because models required endless recruitment in markets with limited demand. 27. In 1630s Netherlands, windmill investment schemes convinced investors that wind power would revolutionize industry and generate enormous profits through innovative mechanical technology, powering manufacturing more efficiently than traditional mills. Promoters promised revolutionary wind technology would allow investors to generate returns, owning mechanical power sources operating continuously without fuel costs. Investors purchased shares without considering whether wind power was more efficient than alternatives or sufficient demand existed for mechanical power services. Many investments failed because wind power was unreliable and markets were smaller than claimed. 28. The 1880s telephone investment bubble convinced investors that companies would generate unlimited profits, connecting every building through revolutionary communication technology, replacing telegraph and postal services completely. Promoters promised universal adoption would create enormous revenues through monthly fees and equipment sales. Investors purchased shares at prices assuming unlimited growth without considering enormous infrastructure costs or whether consumers would pay premium prices for telephone services. Many investments lost value when construction costs were higher than anticipated and adoption rates were slower than projected. 29. In 1720s England, insurance schemes convinced investors they could generate guaranteed profits, selling policies against impossible risks like alien invasions and dragon attacks that supposedly required coverage for improbable catastrophic events. Promoters promised innovative risk assessment would allow selling coverage for any threat while charging premiums, generating enormous profits because events would never occur. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether products addressed genuine needs or companies possessed actuarial expertise. Most schemes collapsed when regulators discovered companies were selling coverage for non-existent risks while using money for personal expenses. 30. The 1970s oil shale schemes convinced investors that revolutionary extraction technology would unlock unlimited reserves trapped in rock formations, making companies more valuable than traditional oil companies through innovative drilling processing previously unusable sources. Promoters promised advanced technology would extract oil from shale at costs competitive with traditional drilling, creating enormous profits for investors in revolutionary energy projects. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether extraction technology worked at commercial scales or processing costs could compete with conventional methods. Most failed because extraction was too expensive and energy-intensive to generate profits. 31. In 1850s California, quartz mining schemes convinced investors that advanced crushing machinery could extract gold from ignored rock formations, leading to investment bubbles and expensive equipment, supposedly processing low-grade ore profitably through revolutionary mineral extraction. Promoters promised industrial technology would extract gold from ore containing trace amounts, generating enormous profits through volume processing. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether techniques could recover enough gold to cover expensive machinery and processing costs. Most failed because extraction costs exceeded gold value, and machinery required constant, expensive maintenance. 32. The 1920s real estate syndication schemes convinced investors they could generate returns, pooling money to purchase commercial properties that would appreciate rapidly through urban development, making real estate more profitable than stocks. Promoters promised professional management and strategic locations would allow groups to generate enormous profits through rental income and appreciation outperforming other investments. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether properties were reasonably priced or rental projections were realistic. Many failed when values declined and income fell short of projections. 33. In 1890s America, patent medicine schemes convinced investors that revolutionary medical discoveries would generate unlimited profits through patent protection, allowing premium prices for breakthrough treatments supposedly curing diseases. Traditional doctors couldn't treat. Promoters promised innovative pharmaceutical research would develop medicines with exclusive protection, generating enormous profits through sales to desperate patients. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether medicines worked or companies possessed scientific expertise. Most failed when regulators required proof medicines worked and investors discovered companies were selling sugar water instead of pharmaceuticals. 34. The 1960s conglomerate boom convinced investors that companies could generate unlimited profits acquiring unrelated businesses through revolutionary management, allowing single corporations to operate profitably in multiple sectors simultaneously. Promoters promised diversification, and professional management would generate enormous profits combining companies and eliminating inefficiencies through centralized control. Investors purchased shares at prices assuming unlimited growth through acquisitions without investigating whether companies could manage diverse operations effectively. Many failed when companies discovered managing unrelated businesses required specialized knowledge that couldn't be centralized. 35. In 1840s America, patent schemes convinced inventors and investors they could generate wealth purchasing patent rights to mechanical devices, supposedly revolutionizing industry through innovative technology and unlimited demand by manufacturers. Promoters promised exclusive protection would allow patent owners to generate royalty income licensing revolutionary technology to companies needing advanced processes. Investors purchased rights without investigating whether inventions worked or genuine market demand existed. Most failed because inventions were impractical or market demand was smaller than claimed. 36. The 1980s tax shelter schemes convinced investors they could eliminate tax obligations while generating profits through partnerships providing enormous deductions, while promising positive returns through real estate and oil exploration. Promoters promised sophisticated structures would allow wealthy investors to reduce taxes legally while participating in profitable ventures. Investors purchased partnerships without investigating whether underlying ventures were profitable or tax benefits would survive scrutiny. Most failed when law changes eliminated deductions and ventures couldn't generate sufficient profits. 37. In 1720s France, coffee plantation schemes convinced investors that Caribbean cultivation would generate unlimited profits through agricultural operations, supplying European demand while providing enormous returns through export sales. Promoters promised tropical agriculture would allow investors to generate profits through exports and constant demand by European consumers developing coffee addiction. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether cultivation was profitable or European demand could support enormous plantation numbers. Most failed because cultivation was more difficult and expensive than suggested, and prices were subject to fluctuations. 38. The 1890s electric power schemes convinced investors that utilities would generate unlimited profits, providing electricity to every building through revolutionary technology, replacing gas lighting and steam power, making electric companies more valuable than railroads. Promoters promised universal adoption would create enormous revenues through monthly fees and equipment sales. Investors purchased shares without investigating enormous infrastructure costs, or whether consumers would pay premium prices for electrical services. Many lost value when construction costs were higher than anticipated and adoption rates were slower than projected. 39 in 1850s England, tea plantation schemes convinced investors that Indian cultivation would generate enormous profits, supplying British demand through operations more profitable than Chinese imports, providing unlimited returns through exports. Promoters promised British control of Indian agriculture would allow plantation investors to generate profits through exports replacing expensive Chinese imports. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether cultivation in India was feasible or operations could compete with established Chinese suppliers. Most failed because Indian cultivation proved more difficult and expensive than claimed. 40. The 1970s computer leasing schemes convinced investors they could generate returns purchasing expensive equipment and leasing to businesses supposedly needing technology but unable to purchase systems outright, creating guaranteed rental income from appreciating technology. Promoters promised rapid business adoption would create enormous demand for leased equipment, generating steady income from businesses renting for more than equipment cost. Investors purchased computers without investigating whether businesses preferred leasing or technology would maintain value. Most failed when technological advances made computers obsolete before lease payments recovered costs. 41. In 1840s America, steam carriage schemes convinced investors that steam-powered vehicles would replace horses completely, leading to investment bubbles in manufacturing companies, promising to revolutionize personal transportation through mechanical vehicles faster and more reliable than horse-drawn transportation. Promoters promised revolutionary steam technology would allow enormous profits through vehicle sales in unlimited demand by consumers needing faster transportation. Investors purchased shares without investigating whether steam vehicles were practical or consumers would pay premium prices for mechanical alternatives. Most failed because steam vehicles were impractical and consumers preferred familiar horse-drawn transportation. 42. The 1920s aviation bubble convinced investors that airplane companies would dominate transportation and generate unlimited profits through passenger airlines and airmail services replacing railroad and automobile transportation, making aviation more profitable than any transportation sector. Promoters promised revolutionary flying technology would allow enormous profits through passenger fares and cargo revenues from air transportation faster than ground alternatives. Investors purchased shares at prices assuming unlimited growth without considering enormous infrastructure costs or whether consumers would pay premium prices. Many lost value when development costs were higher than anticipated. 43. In 1680s England, alchemy schemes convinced investors they could generate unlimited wealth funding research into transmuting base metals into gold through revolutionary chemical processes, supposedly discovered by natural philosophers understanding advanced metallurgy. Promoters promised scientific metal transmutation would allow enormous profits, converting cheap materials into precious metals using secret formulas. Investors funded research without investigating whether transmutation was possible or processes were based on genuine science. Most failed because transmutation was impossible, and alchemists were either deluded or deliberately defrauding investors. 44. The 1990s internet infrastructure schemes convinced investors they could generate returns building fiber optic networks supposedly in unlimited demand by internet companies and consumers needing enormous bandwidth for online activities. Promoters promised explosive internet growth would create enormous demand for telecommunications capacity, generating steady income from network infrastructure companies would rent. Investors funded companies without investigating whether bandwidth demand would grow as projected, or markets could support enormous infrastructure being constructed. Most failed when the dot-com bubble burst and internet companies reduced telecommunications spending. 45. And finally, the 2000s mortgage-backed securities schemes convinced investors they could generate guaranteed profits, purchasing bonds backed by home mortgages supposedly representing safe investments, because real estate prices would rise forever and homeowners would always make payments. Promoters promised innovative financial engineering would allow substantial returns through diversified mortgage portfolios, distributing risk while providing steady income. Investors purchased securities without investigating whether underlying mortgages were sound or real estate prices could appreciate indefinitely. When housing prices collapsed and defaults exploded, investors discovered they had purchased securities backed by worthless mortgages. Here's the truth about get-rich-quick schemes. They work exactly once, for the people selling them. For 5 centuries, humans have proven that when someone promises easy wealth, we're willing to ignore common sense and basic economics. The real secret to these schemes isn't the promise of easy money. It's our eternal willingness to believe that this time will be different. Subscribe if you want more proof that history's greatest lesson is that we never learn from history.